And we're going to begin with a presentation by Alex.
I presume that most of you are not from New York. So to set up our conversation, I thought I would tell you a little bit about how New York got to be the way it is. And I'd like to start with a quotation from the great 20th century architect Le Corbusier, who said in 1947, "New York is not a finished or completed city. It gushes up. On my next trip, it will be different." Those of us who have visited are asked this question: when you were there in 1939 or in 1928 or in 1926 or in 1920, was such and such already there? And I put this image on because there's New York gushing up. That's the new #1 World Trade Center. There's the new Frank Gehry apartment house, and I thought that depicted it. And when I got here, the maintenance man was looking at it. He said, "You know, I don't think any of those buildings were there in 1947. And in fact, peeking from behind the Gehry building is the Woolworth building, which was once the tallest building in New York. Everything else on that picture is brand new. That is how New York is changing. And it's a growing city, something that people forget. There was a period where we had a decline in the 1970s. But we have been gushing up ever since. And the reason we've been gushing up is we're a global city. We're the financial capital of the world. We're an immigrant city, a cultural city, a post-industrial city, a tourist destination. Let me show you what I mean. We are still one of the major ports in the United States. We are one of the major airports in the United States. We are a city of immigrants. Nearly 36% of the population of New York City was born outside the United States. That's 3 times the rest of the country. And if you look at who they are, they're to some degree different from the immigrants in other large immigrant cities in the United States. The Dominican Republic is #1. We have Haitians in great numbers. Chinese you'll find in many places. And you can see the evidence of this all over, not just in Chinatown, which is the upper picture, but there's a spot in Queens. We are a city of diverse cultural activities, and this is very important. This is one of the major industries of the United States and of New York. And it's not just the theater district, which you see there. But if you go to Central Park, you can see a jazz concert. And if you want to buy a Russian doll, you can do that in front of the Metropolitan Museum. It's incredibly diverse. We are, of course, Wall Street, the city of finance. And we have a growing office inventory. And a growing amount of jobs. We're now at 4 million jobs. We are no longer an industrial city. We once were, but we're now down to less than 74,000 industrial jobs. But we have a growing high-tech industrial component of our employment. We are changing all the time. And we have become a major tourist attraction in the world at this point. In 2012, 52 million tourists, of which most came from the United States. Now, the reason we keep growing is we have invested a tremendous amount of money in the capital infrastructure of the city. We keep improving public management. We have a great public realm. We have a welcoming environment for in-migration. There are opportunities to make a living here, diverse cultural attractions, and lifestyle opportunities, and let me show you what I mean. We have been consistently investing in the capital plant, starting with the water supply system, rail and mass transit, parkways and highways, and the public realm, that is streets, squares, and parks. We started in the second quarter of the 19th century creating a water supply system which is second to none in the world. We have the freshest, cleanest, safest water of any major city in the world. We started building railroad stations. And when we build railroad stations, we always did what is now the top idea, transit-oriented development. But we've been doing that from the beginning. This is the basic infrastructure of Grand Central Terminal. It's several subway lines, underground walkways, connections to buildings, and when you look at it, remember that in 1913, It was a rail yard over which the streets went, and eventually by 1930, everything that you see there in white, including the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the Yale Club, St. Bartholomew's Church, all are built on a rail yard. That's called transit-oriented development today. And it looks like that, and it's not an accident. We built a subway system. We were very imaginative about it in the beginning because we extended subways where there weren't anybody yet. That's the number 7 subway line, probably the most exciting line in the city today, going out into Queens on the way to what you now know as Shea Stadium in Flushing in 1917. That's the same area today. In those days, we actually invested in sending out subway lines before the market existed. And the investment in parks and parkways and highways is extraordinary. This is what we owned in 1910. And the first parkways already existed, the Bronx River Parkway and that little edge of ran along the Harlem River. The following decade, on Long Island, the chairman of the Long Island State Park and Parkway Commission started building parkways to get to Jones Beach. That gentleman is responsible for much of the rest of what you're going to see, Robert Moses. And the Port Authority had been established, and it took over running the Holland Tunnel. In the next decade, more tunnels, the George Washington Bridge, a whole lot of things the Port Authority did. And Robert Moses got appointed the Parks Commissioner of New York. And suddenly, the parkways extended throughout the city. And the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. And the borough president started building highways along the edges of Manhattan. And more parkways, and the Long Island Expressway, and more highways, and more parkways. And by the time that we were done, we had a system of parks and parkways and bridges and tunnels that is really quite extraordinary, without which we would not have become a metropolitan region of 15 million people. We also invested in a rather unique public realm. It's not just places like Fifth Avenue. It's things like Eastern Parkway, which is a 19th century street, which is extraordinary in that it doesn't exist only for the movement of vehicles or the delivery of goods or people. It's also a park. It's also a place people can relax. It is the very basis of a civil society that is our city. We have been investing in parks so much that within a 5-minute walk, there is a park for most of the United States, rather most of New York City. And what I have put in are the airports, the manufacturing zones, and the utility areas. When you add them, there's almost no part of the city of New York that isn't within walking distance of a park. And we keep adding to it. The upper slide is of the 5-mile-long, 550-acre Hudson River Park, which if you haven't seen, is on any day when it's sunny, packed with people riding bicycles, rollerblading, walking, sunning themselves, playing all the different things along the way. And again, that investment produces all that construction that you see there. It's not an accident. These are 2 more recent parks. This is the Brooklyn Bridge Park on top. That's a 85-acre park that has just been created in the last decade. And there is the Queens West-South Park and Gantry Park, which has been growing over 20 years. And in all these cases, you see new construction. We also have a program to improve the natural environment called the Green Streets Program, which began in the administration of Ed Koch. And by 2008, we had taken these traffic triangles in 2,300 cases and turned them into assets for the environment. And we keep inventing new ways of regulating our city. The gentleman responsible for this is sitting in the second row in the front here. When he was the executive director of the planning department, we wanted to save Times Square. That's Con House sitting up there. And the planning department invented a regulation which would spur a private market reaction. This is what Times Square looks like today. The rezoning required 10,000 square feet, that's wrong, 1,000 square feet of illuminated signage for every 50 feet of linear frontage. It's not an accident Times Square looks that way. We also kept investing in new ways of management. Central Park had become a disaster by the early 1970s. We began to find new ways, business improvement districts, conservancies, that would take care of this infrastructure. And we even have more recent forms. These are all new kinds of investments in the public realm. As a result, we have a very diverse set of opportunities for living in New York. It's not just what you see in Manhattan. These are all outside of Manhattan. Remember, Manhattan's only about 20% of the population. So to get back to Le Corbusier, New York will be a different city on your next visit because we keep adjusting our city to meet the demands of our culture, our economy, and our evolving personal lives. And that should set up an interesting conversation among everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Ken? Yeah.
I'm just going to speak briefly and without, can you hear me okay everywhere? And without slides. Just to kind of expand on what Alex has done and make a few general broad comments. First, maybe most of you are familiar with the trajectory of New York in the last, well, it says 100 years, but let's think 116 years, because the city as we know it comes into existence in 1898. And what happens just broadly is in the next 30 years or so, New York surpasses London as the financial center and the largest city in the world, becomes really, in most respects, the greatest city in the world by 1930. It sort of treads water, I would say, during the Great Depression, despite all the efforts of LaGuardia and Robert Moses. Its unemployment is among the highest in the United States, so it's hard to think of this as a great period. World War II, New York has a huge role to play. The port of embarkation for everybody going to fight in Europe and all the equipment and stuff, and best Liberty Port and all sorts of other stuff. But if you think of it in a broader perspective, New York is losing in World War II because the government is building factories for Chrysler in Detroit area, textile mills in the South, and they're not building really anything in New York. So the foundation is laid for New York's troubles later. Then New York has a brief respite of glory after World War II, in part because it's the only man left standing, in the sense that London and Paris, we forget, were impoverished after World War II, at least for 5 years. People were almost hungry. Berlin and Vienna and Moscow and Leningrad and Tokyo have been blown to hell. So almost New York by default becomes the cultural capital of the world. This is the only place where there's money and vast. But I would argue that the city's decline begins certainly by the 1950s. Alex mentioned it was more than 1 million people in manufacturing. It was, in fact, the largest in the world in terms of value added by manufacture, more than LA or Chicago or Pittsburgh, obviously. And Germany and Japan weren't competitive yet, so it was New York. But our decline begins really certainly by the middle of the 1950s, when it suddenly drops out. It's no longer the greatest manufacturing center. We have been hemorrhaging jobs, manufacturing jobs, for 60 years now. And so that's a huge change. And soon after that, we were hemorrhaging lots of other stuff. Corporate headquarters in the 1970s, human beings. New York lost more people in the 1970s than most American places had people. There were only half a dozen cities that in fact, in the 1970s, Brooklyn and the Bronx by themselves lost more people than Detroit, each separately. And you could have imagined that New York was going to follow the pattern of Detroit. I realize there's a lot of complexities here, but it certainly was on a downward, and it's now turned. And so then what we've got in the last 30 years or so is the city has made a remarkable turnaround, and that might be part of the discussion. But I just wanted to just remind us then of some of the things New York did in the 20th century that were so, I think, remarkable. The bridges, the tunnels, the Lincoln, the Holland, the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, the Queens Midtown Tunnel, those are all built in this time. The bridges, 59th Street, Trabert, Whitestone, Throgs Neck, Tappan Zee, George Washington, Verrazano Narrows, Bayonne, Outer Bridge, all those things. Expressways and parkways that never existed in the 19th century, obviously. the North River sewage treatment plant, which cost more than $1 billion and took forever to build. We built the best public transit system in the world before 1940. In 1940, there was no second place. Now, obviously, there's a lot of competition, and we have slipped. We can talk about that in a minute. We built these great things, like Alex said, Central Park. Madison Square Garden becomes the world's, at least America's, most famous indoor arena. Battery Park City, just think of that. Didn't exist 40 years ago. Airports. Together, I think we're the leading air hub in the world. Atlanta Airport has, I want to say, a little under 100 million passengers, and if you add LaGuardia and Newark and JFK together, it's more than that. So we have lots of airports, lots of traffic. As Alex said, in the 21st century, which may be the century of water, as the 20th century was of oil, one thing we got a lot of is water. Not just for today, because we went and stole the water, more or less, actually paid for it, but upstate, far upstate, where there is water. And so we have that's a great advantage. And then I think one of the miracles was in 9/11. We never think about this. If you weren't below Chambers Street, and you were not very observant, as I'm not, and you kind of stuck in your apartment and had your head glued to your desk and just went out to get something to eat, you would not have known there was a problem in New York. Nobody went without water or food, or subways ran. Everything worked in New York after this huge disaster. I think that's part of it. The wires are below ground. Whoever thinks of this, right? Go to Tokyo and look at wires. You can't even see the ground in most world cities for the wires. But let me just say. So I agree with Alex. A lot of it's good news, but let's just admit that we have some real challenges. Think of the subways. Now they're recovering. We have about 60% more riders than we had at the bottom in 1970s. But how we're going to pay for the subways? I mean, half the blogs I get are about fights about how many billions of dollars and who's going to pay for it. And the truth is, nobody knows who's going to pay for it. We are about limited. We've about reached our borrowing limit. We now spend billions of dollars just in debt service. So it's almost pretty soon all of the fare box will just go to pay off the debts. Who's going to run the subway? That's one problem. The bridges. Need I mention the Tappan Zee Bridge, which heard lawyers say he wouldn't even ride on the Tappan Zee Bridge. It's interesting, Robert Moses didn't build it, but still, the bridges are in trouble. The roads are the worst in Christendom, I think, in many respects. And the airports, well, you see people all the time quoting and say this looks more like the third world airport and the other airports look better. There are water pipes. We have the best water system, but unfortunately the pipes are often 100 years old or more. And the way we found out that they're leaking is the street collapses somewhere. I mean, we're doing a good job of trying to keep a lid on it, but those pipes are pretty old. And then the big problem, the overriding problem for most American cities, is that the federal government got the goose that laid the golden age in 1913 when it instituted the income tax. And so it's much harder for localities to raise income taxes. And so all cities are strapped. New York's problems now are affordable housing, so in some ways we wish other places wish they had this problem. So many people want to move there that the prices get bid up. But I think one of the challenges that we may want to focus on is how is New York going to deal with the challenges of the 21st century to remain a great, if not the greatest world city in 2200, 2100.
John?
I was asked to talk about public-private partnerships. It's one of those neat words that defies definition, in my view. When you listen to these kinds of presentations, you have a sense of how neat everything is, how well things fit together, and how New York City has achieved fantastic gains, which it did. So I want to take time to give you a specific example of how public policy and public action interlocked with private action to achieve a successful transfer or change in the urban setting. And the setting I'm going to take is the one you're sitting in, the west side of Manhattan. So picture starting in 1950 when I was 12 years old, where to the west of us would have been piers all the way down to the Battery. And I am old enough to have seen the Normandy, the great liner, on fire in 1942 at Pier 68 here. And up from the piers was a highway, an elevated highway, the Miller Highway, that had been built in the 1920s. And on the upland area were a whole host of uses that could be described as supporting retail, Tribeca, now one of the highest per square foot residential areas, $3,000 a square foot for condominiums, was the meat, butter, and egg market. The meat market is still there today, surrounded by housing, luxury housing, hotels, and now the Whitney Art Museum returns to Greenwich Village where it had its original roots. And so you can take that all the way up, the nature of the communities in the upland area, for the most part, working class people, Irish who were longshoremen. The piers in New York were primarily the domain of the Irish. The piers in Brooklyn were primarily Italian Americans, and supported by various different kinds of tenement housing for the most part, interlocked with warehouses and all kinds of light manufacturing uses with rail yards all the way. That's what it would have looked like in 1950. How did it change? Well, if you look at today, you'll see coming up from the Battery Park City, and you'll see a host of different things that are happening all the way up that represent public-private partnerships, as it were. Partnerships is an overstatement. Public-private meeting of goals, I guess, or something along those lines. So that process of change from what I described to what we have today, and it's still going on, it's not finished, was not a neat process. It was not a process that responded to a plan that the government proposed, although, as I'll describe later, there was certainly a lot of government direction in what happened. And it was a process punctuated by bitter political struggles, bitter community struggles between governors and mayors, between community groups and business, and also financial failure, because I could list for you the attempts by the private sector to capitalize on change, which failed. And so you could go through the whole process, and I'll do it quickly for you. So we start with Battery Park City, an initiative which came from essentially the Rockefeller family, David Rockefeller and his brother, Nelson Rockefeller, using the fill from the World Trade Center to build an extension of the upland area into the river, something that, as I'm sure Ken could give you chapter and verse on how Manhattan has grown over the years with fill. And that initiative was a government initiative, but it was responding to the business interest in Lower Manhattan. Punctuated, as I said, by a bitter struggle, because the mayor of the city of New York, Mayor Lindsay, didn't necessarily want Battery Park City. He wanted another project on the other side of the river called Manhattan Landing, which has its remnants today, but which never achieved the success that Battery Park City did. And when Battery Park City was built, nothing happened. It was a sandlot for years. No New York City developer would attempt to build out Battery Park City. A Canadian developer came to New York and undertook the initiative to build the commercial center that was known was known as the World Financial Center. Sam Lafrac built the first residential housing, and one of the folklore stories about New York is how Sam had 5 different groundbreakings and a bulldozer going back and forth for a long period of time before he attempted to turn a shovel and actually build a FHA-insured 207 project. Then you come up from there and you begin to see the kind of change that was responding to the direction that the government had given, because there are a host of different planning initiatives from the City Planning Commission that gave direction to what was to be the change from the uses that I described to the change of predominant residential and recreational uses. And so you came up from there, But all of that was punctuated by another great struggle, because the government, essentially led by the Lindsay administration, had a great plan called Westway, and that was to be the planning framework for what was to happen in this transformational period. This was a plan that caused a furor of political opposition from Washington all the way to the side streets around this particular project. And so that plan was not adopted. It was failed. It didn't happen. In fact, the money was transferred to support the subway system by the head of the MTA, man named Dick Ravitch, which I thought was the right decision, even though, as Alex knows, I was one of the forefronts of fighting for the Westway project. So the failure of the Westway project left a planning gap, although many of the elements of the Westway project were incorporated because the private sector seized on on the opportunities and on the direction that the Westway project gave as it articulated goals for the transformational period. And then you came up from that, and this particular building was another enormous fight. It had 6 different locations. It was supposed to be on the waterfront, on a pier, an old pier. It didn't get that location. And after a specific struggle with it for a while, they thought that we were going to put it in Battery Park City. It ended up here. And getting it built was an enormous difficulty with enormous opposition again. So to give you an illustration of how the private sector seized on these opportunities, the Chelsea piers, which were scheduled for demolition, entrepreneurs came, businessmen, not necessarily New Yorkers again, people from outside New York, and transformed it into the successful recreational use it is today. And while this was all happening in the upland area, the uses that were there slowly moved to other areas of the city because the sites they had were dysfunctional for traffic or for other reasons. And young people moved into the area, starting primarily with Soho, but then moving westward. And the working class communities changed, and the unions that supported the piers lost their political power. And in fact, that allowed for the development of the area in a more aggressive way. The High Line, which in the period I described initially I didn't mention, was in fact, I actually saw trains on the High Line bringing product down the High Line. It was transformed largely because of the interest of people in making such a project successful without large amounts of public money. So in this mess, I'm trying to give you a sense of how messy the process is, how unneat it is, how complex it is, and how opportunistic it is for the private sector. So that's why public-private partnership doesn't strike me as being properly descriptive, because it really isn't a partnership. It's more the result of opportunistic reaction by private developers to sensible, practical economic situations given with a taste of government intervention in terms of planning direction and in terms of funding. I hope I didn't talk too long.
So, well, that's pretty much the entire history of New York City. We have to sum up here in a few more minutes. I'll ask a few questions, then I'll open up to questions for the audience, and there are microphones to which you're directed if you have questions. So, John, let me begin with you, because public-private partnership also has a more specific meaning now. Under the Bloomberg administration, you had, for instance, the creation of parks like Brooklyn Bridge Park, which Alex showed, and in fact, in a way, the High Line as well. These were specific undertakings that involved private investment and the expectation that there would be that public money would be put into this, but that there would be private support in the long run. There's been a lot of criticism of that particular kind of project by, for instance, the current administration, which sees this somehow as corrupting. of the public interest. At the same time, of course, those have been two hugely successful projects. Maybe you could speak more specifically, since we are facing, as all of you have alluded to now, lots of huge problems, fiscal challenges with the public realm and subways and everything else, what that particular kind of public-private partnership has done in New York City and what its up and downsides have been.
Well, as I tried to say in my initial talk, the government doesn't necessarily have to use its own money to achieve success in terms of development. What it has to do is give the initial direction and at the same time make, I think, discrete investments. And I think the private sector will respond. The West Side Yards, I think, is a good example of that. There, the planning department and the city planning commission, under the direction of the mayor, followed a zoning change that made the Hudson Yards development possible.
Just to be clear, since the Hudson Yards development, I assume we all know here, is actually literally across the street.
It's
this vast rail yards, which will become a major site of
Rail yards covered.
Covered, of course, the covered rail yards. Otherwise, it'd be a little complicated to put large buildings there.
But the point is, sort of illustrates my point. The project that is being built is, in fact, the fallback project, because the initial project was supposed to have been the site of the Olympics,
yeah,
which Alex knows all about,
right.
Which was, again, characterized by the things I tried to describe: a bitter struggle, failed, a fallback position, and the fallback position incorporated many of the concepts that were in the original plan. And then they were seen by the private sector as an opportunity.
Yeah.
And they were willing to put their money into it and invest in it. And
well, Westway itself, which was going to do a vast redevelopment of this entire area, failed, and yet piecemeal, we have been doing, as you say, parts of what Westway tried to do, to create green spaces up and down the west side, to add residential, to get housing along the west side. I mean, I guess one of the questions I have to ask you now is, in retrospect, was the failure of Westway bad?
No. I would say today that what we're going to end up on the west side of Manhattan is in fact better than what Westway would have resulted in my opinion. And that's has a ring of credibility because it's a statement against interest. And I think that, but the point that I'm making is that the Westway plan described many of the elements of what has actually occurred, and the private sector responded to those government initiatives. And so it is the combination of, take the Battery Park City. Public money was used to fit for the fill, public money was used to give the framework of a plan, but it took some time to have the development community find that site attractive for all the reasons that Ken said. Everybody thought we were sinking into the sea, and in fact we were not. It turned out to be.
Well, also, where Brooklyn Bridge Park now is, I believe, Alex, was a site that had been considered for the Olympics as well.
Yes,
so there was a transformational idea there.
I think John made 2 points that it's important to focus on. The first is that there was a direction given by whatever planning entity there was at that time, whether it was the Rockefellers doing Battery Park City or the Planning Commission was proposing Westway. The second thing is that there was always a battle. The political process evolved into a series of public actions, and where I think we are different from many other cities is that in all those cases, the public actions were considered within an environment in which the private sector was expected to respond. It was a private market reaction to the investment. And I think that's very significant.
Right. This is But this is, of course, true and very important, but now New York City is talking about certain kinds of problems that seem to require more government intervention and are not as clearly in the interests of private developers. For instance, all the talk about affordable housing. I mean, I should have put that in a better way and say, it's not the financing of affordable housing, whatever affordable means, which is now obviously the big challenge in the city, requires clearly some government initiative, some kinds of strong government action. It's not going to just happen because the government says it wants it. So maybe, Ken, I can ask
Well, it speaks
you.
to what Mr. Zuccotti just said, in the sense that there was a time, once upon a time, there was public money for public housing, and we think of the 1930s and the United States Housing Act in 1937, and then later various subsidies to home ownership and housing that generally have frittered away. So now we can talk about affordable housing all we want, but if we don't have private involvement, public-private partnership, whatever you want to call it, and what de Blasio's arguing now, whether you get 20%, you know, over in Queens, whether 20% of it should be affordable, or 30 or 40%, but you're having to leverage how much can you make or ask the private sector to build without them just walking away and say, you know, Toronto's not that far away, or something else. And so there's always this competition among cities. There's a limit as to what you can do to the private sector, how much. We'll see whether it's working. I mean, we'll see whether it works.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think one of the things that I wanted to just mention that's kind of odd about New York is if you think of the war, you know, most people want river views or the 18th hole views. You want a view of something, and water is really those high on the list. But New York has never been that way. In other words, along the edges of the water, first of all, there wasn't much development. If you look at Manhattan in the 1940s, let's say, when we started, it's a wedding cake. You know, everything is the central spine, except for Wall Street, in the middle, and then it goes off toward the edges, and it's low tenement housing, warehouses, light manufacturing, whatever. And now what we have seen, partly because of the West Side Improvement and these other things, is enormous private investment and public investment, and all you have to do is walk the High Line or anything else to see it, that now it's the edges where the action is, whether it's Greenpoint or Williamsburg or West Side or whatever. Relatively little has been being built on the east side or the west side, partly because we're trying to landmark the whole place. But that's where the action is now. And if it weren't for the private sector and public help, it wouldn't happen at all.
Can I, John, I was about to say one thing, but if I may just say a little note about this, which I think is interesting in particular to New York, but maybe is a lesson for developing cities. When you say that, I was thinking about Madison Square Park and the redeveloped plaza. Alex was talking about the way in which so many of these traffic triangles around the city have been recuperated and turned into something else. And that's a very dramatic example under the Bloomberg administration of taking what was an extremely wide and unpleasant and dangerous avenue crossing and turning the traffic triangle there at Madison Square, at 23rd Street and 5th Avenue, into a public plaza. And I mention this because Michael Beirut, the graphic designer whose office is there, had said that when the idea of turning the street at that place into a plaza came up, he thought this was the most insane thing he had ever heard, because you have one of the most beautiful parks in the city right there. Who is going to sit in the middle of the street when they can literally walk into this beautiful park right there? And why am I telling you this long anecdote? Because that plaza has been hugely successful, and with food carts, but also because people just want to sit in the middle of things. This isn't so much a development thing, but it does, I think, have to do with the nature of urban life, and especially in a place like New York. The idea, when you go into a park, you're in it, and it's beautiful, but the idea of being in that plaza, it speaks, I think, to what has drawn many people to cities, and certainly to New York, the idea that you are literally in the middle of things. You have the view up to the Empire State Building and to the Flatiron. You feel like you're in things. I say this because the water is often a view out, but people will look at the way people sit even in Brooklyn Bridge Park. They sit in, looking at people in the city. This is actually the great attraction of New York, to be in it, not necessarily to dream of what's outside. I'm sorry for that long thing, but I think it's one of the more sort of telling things about the way people act in the city and what people want in a city.
I think there's a very unfortunate thing in what you suggested before, which is where we are in the public dialogue. In 1934, Mayor LaGuardia was elected to run our city. There was an enormous need for affordable housing, far more than today. We were in the middle of the Depression, and the mayor thought it would be a good idea to establish a public housing authority. And he got legislation through Albany and established it. And the first public housing in the United States, the first houses on the Lower East Side, a rehab project, a walk-up, and entirely done with city money. We now own 170,000 units, mostly financed by the federal government, but not all, that used to be a beacon of how to run publicly owned housing. And over the last 20 years, the decline has been dramatic, and we now have a state of disrepair which is scandalous. And I find myself generally amazed that nobody is saying, deal with what you own, which is in terrible state of disrepair. Yeah. No, we have to create new housing for persons of low income. Meanwhile, the grandmother on the 18th floor where the elevator doesn't work can't get down to buy groceries.
John.
The question of affordable housing begs, the question, you're begging the question. There isn't any way you can house poor people without a subsidy.
Yeah,
you have to face that reality. Now, the tragedy is that the Housing Act of 1949 said that every American shall have a decent, safe, and sanitary home. We failed to achieve that goal. Robert Taft, who was a Republican, was a sponsor. In fact, he had his name on the bill. When the cities were all burning and when we had the great conflicts of the 1960s, the federal government stepped up and provided additional subsidies, additional to the, and that again represented a consensus between Republicans and Democrats. People forget that the Section 8 program, which was a very effective subsidy, was the program started in the George Romney leadership at HUD when Richard Nixon was the president of the United States. So what has happened is obviously is that the federal government has stepped away from the bipartisan attempt to help cities. And as Ken says, it's more urgent today than it was even 20 years ago. So when the mayor says he's going to build 200,000, I think it is, Alex, affordable housing, you can't solve the problem of housing people with a low income within the confines of the budget of the city of New York. It can't be done. Now, admittedly, he's trying because the federal government doesn't seem to be interested in the programs that they were, on a bipartisan basis, in favor of in the 1960s and early 70s.
Well, isn't part of the problem, John, though, that, look, housing in America is cheap. That's what we got to start with. It's incredibly affordable in world terms. Now, you mostly don't want to live there, but that's what, you know, there are dozens of American cities where the average house is under $100,000. So in a sense, the problem of New York is, it's multiple problems. One is it's an island, at least this part of it is. But the problem is that people want to live here. And the only way you can reduce the price of housing is as in Detroit or Cleveland, where you can buy lots of houses for essentially nothing because there's no demand for it. So in a sense, if you're planning a city or anywhere else, you're kind of in a conundrum. The better your better job, the better the city is, the more people will be attracted, housing prices will go up, and it will overwhelm almost always the efforts of any government to subsidize that because it just goes up even more. The problem now is how expensive can New York City become and still remain competitive with Houston, which is now the poster child of the successful city because there's no regulation or very little and everything's cheap and they don't bother with lots of other stuff. But anyway, that's what's held out as the model now.
I think, by the way, the question is also, since affordability is a meaningless word, in a way, affordable to whom? So it's not just the question of dealing with housing of the poor in NYCHA, but also a middle class that feels constrained, right? Because there's not a great deal of housing for people of middle income.
But John's point about the absence of subsidies is central to all of this. It isn't that government isn't spending money. It is what it is spending money on. There are lots of demands. I was arguing before that we need more subway lines. I think we need a tunnel across the East River, a tunnel across the Hudson River. If you looked at the investments that we used to be making, I think there are a lot of them that we need to do. But the money isn't there because the money is being spent on something else. Or the public is not willing to be taxed to pay for it. And John's point about the politics could not be more important. We used to have a consensus. We used to have a bipartisan way of running, dealing with these problems. We may still have this in New York, but it's clear that on a national level it's broken down.
But do you think that, I mean, so we're talking about public-private partnerships, whatever this might mean. Do you think that the idea is that, okay, if the government is broken, somehow the private interests will essentially make up the money? Is this basically the thinking here, that, well, we can't rely on the federal government to give us money, so somehow we're going to provide initiatives for private interests?
At least I don't buy that.
Yeah.
When 9/11 happened, nobody in New York thought we would get any money from Washington. We had to be resilient. We were given $21 billion by Congress and President Bush. It never occurred to us that we would get money. For me, as a New Yorker, the realization that the rest of the country came to our assistance was an extraordinary event. And I would argue that government has one responsibility and the private sector a different one.
Right.
And where I was going was to say the government ought to be making expenditures that have a spin-off effect so that the private sector then responds and creates jobs and other opportunities. But there are things the government has to do.
John, you would, I assume, agree with
No,
this?
I mean, the private sector is going to be in it if there's a profit. If there's no profit, they're not going to be in it. That's as simple as that. And it's very hard to produce housing at low cost in New York City because of all the factors that would, you could list them all. And so that they can't make a profit and house poor people. It can't be done.
I mean, it's not just housing. There are subway issues. You talked about the extension of the 7 line, which is the most interesting line to here, but that's the only subway station that's opened in, I don't know, Kenneth was for 80 years or something in New York City. So, I mean, it's obviously there's greater demand for all sorts of the infrastructural changes, tunnels, as you say. Private interests are not going to.
Take what you just said. There is one. On Roosevelt Island, there is a new subway station. It did not exist when I was a boy. I even remember working for John, and he asked me whether we should pay money to have a funicular go over to the island because the subway wasn't ready. That changed everything. And the people who made money on it were the private developers who built 5,000 units of housing there. We're now building a new university there that's going to provide technological jobs. I'm arguing that those are the kinds of investments we ought to be making because that's where we can get the private sector to do things so they can make money off it. That doesn't mean that the subsidies shouldn't be there, and they were.
I want to invite people to ask some questions.
I want to ask a question about the affordable housing plan, which all three of you seem fairly skeptical of, at least the feasibility of it. And Professor Jackson mentioned the possibility that developers would go off to Toronto, and also the possibility that working class residents would go off to Houston. In the latter situation, where New York City can no longer house people, not just the working poor, but middle class people, policemen, firefighters, school teachers, what happens to the city? I mean, what's the scenario there? Is there any precedent for that?
Clearly, housing needs to be affordable. But let me just say one thing. Private development did build poor affordable housing in the 19th century in the form of dumbbell tenements and old tenements. We wouldn't want to live there, but at that level, it did at one point work. I'll be very cynical and say that I read just the other day that in Florida, the people were just thrilled when de Blasio won the election because it said the exact people we're trying to attract are the people he wants to tax. They couldn't give a damn about attracting more middle or working class people to Florida. Everybody wants the upper income trade. That's the bottom line. But in a country like the United States where we have so many thousands of municipalities, everybody's on their own bottom. You really want to attract people who have resources, not people who need public assistance. So essentially, there are other places in the United States which are making hay every time New York City raises taxes on people. I know myself, people who say I've got, and by the way, the city is also much bigger than anybody realizes. You know, there are all these people who don't count as residents. They're here 182 days and not 184 days because their lawyers and accountants tell them you must prove you're not here. And so they're in Florida, they're in, I know this. They say, I got to leave town. And so and movie stars, all sorts of people on Central Park West and other places, but they're not counted. I don't know where they actually legally live. Maybe in Florida, but they don't live here. So we actually have more people than we would ever realize if we counted people. And how do you get it to the hundreds of thousands of pied-à-terres in the city, or in other words, places that are rented, but people don't live there? You know, and there's some ideas about doing that. But I do think the problem generally in the United States, or let's look at London, which is our main competitor in the world, really not Houston, but it's London. The British government has got all sorts of inducements for really rich people to live in London and pay, I don't know, $20,000 a year tax. I can't, something to them that's trivial, and then there's no tax. So that London is, you know, the booming city in Europe, certainly the booming, England has completely deindustrialized. London is carrying the whole country now, and I don't know whether those out-of-towners, Russian billionaires, Indian billionaires, all sorts of people who are moving to London, but they're being attracted by low taxes. And it's exactly the opposite of what de Blasio is saying. So if we want to tax you, you know, one of the differences between now and 100 years from now, capital wasn't as mobile and people weren't as mobile. You were from New York. You didn't just move Colgate Palmolive to Arizona or something like this. Now you can. So we got all these signs around New York City, Colgate, Pepsi, Domino, of what was, you know, because somebody outcompeted us and moved it around. So in the United States, and maybe around the world, we're following the lowest prices. And I mean, I certainly need things to be more affordable for myself too. So do we all. But I think I think the city's probably main problem is attracting people with options.
John, you were going to say.
I don't want to overstate it, but your question's a very good one. But there are ways in which you can build housing, as Michael says, whatever is affordable, but housing that is less expensive in New York City. There are large areas of Brooklyn and Queens that are presently zoned light manufacturing and that are underutilized land. And it would be perfectly possible to rezone those areas. There'd be some fights. Of course, you'd have to accept that. There'd be some fights, questions about jobs, et cetera. But those areas could be rezoned. There are plenty. I could rattle them off in Brooklyn. You could even see East New York, which is an area that was characteristically always referred to as the worst area of the city. That could also be a source of affordable housing because you could attract developers there if you could buy the land inexpensively and if you could get the unions to come into some kind of project labor agreement where they would bill for less, or in the alternative, use non-union labor. That's the leverage you'd have to use with them to get the kind of agreements that you need. You could bring the cost of housing down. But in the end, you're not going to house the poorest that way. It's just not going to happen without some kind of subsidy. But you could bring it into the, in my view, into the lower middle class or higher levels of working poor. One of the things I disagree with the mayor about is I don't understand why we're focusing on Manhattan as a place where poor people have to live. He's focused on gentrification. Why not build it in the neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens where, in fact, the people don't want to leave those areas. They want to stay. Why concentrate on an affordable housing program that focuses on 80/20 in 59th Street and 9th Avenue? Who wants to live on 59th Street and 9th Avenue? They want to stay in Gowanus. So it's not hopeless. That's what I would say.
And there was a time when the Lower West Side, we've been focusing down on the Lower West Side, which was zoned like manufacturing.
Yes.
And I remember Seymour Durst used to always be railing against this, says we need housing. These factories are not coming back, but we hoped that somehow if we kept it zoned for manufacturing, the manufacturing would come back from Mississippi or Indonesia. Of course, it wasn't coming back. And we just, in a way, delayed the thing because we had tried to save people. I remember I was on the vestry of Trinity Church once, and we were essentially throwing out the printers. You know, they can hardly make a living in New York, and they had these old print districts, World Trade Think that, and others. And we were making it hard for them because they wanted to convert the real estate to Class A office space. And I thought, how is it that this really wealthy church is throwing people that on the ear? But you know, they were right. Printers were not going to survive in Lower Manhattan, and we could have kept them on another 5 or 10 years. But basically, that industry was gone, and we needed office space.
Yes, sir.
To housing, I'm Michael Chase. I'm visiting from Colorado, but a proud native of Brooklyn and yes, Long Island. I think I read an architectural record recently that New York was going to experiment with requiring developers to provide affordable housing for middle-income people, defined as folks earning up to $200,000 a year. And I wonder if you could comment on the wisdom of such an effort and the probable success or maybe other techniques for making that happen.
Well, there are two parts to the issue. The first is whether we're going to get enough housing to handle the people that are coming here. Houston, which you brought up, Ken, as a model, in the last decade, built enough housing to house all the people that migrated there, virtually 500,000 people or more. And the price of houses did not go up because they had production. So the first thing you've got to figure out, it seems to me, is how do you increase the production? Forget about who it's for, because we are attracting all these people. The second you ask is, will the requirement that you have a certain percentage work? Well, first of all, the mayor is proposing this at the moment for places that are going to get zoning changes. The idea being that if somebody wants to increase the number of people that can be on the property, that is increasing the value of the property, and therefore a portion of that value ought to go to goals the city has. In this case, the goal would be to provide affordable housing. We actually have such legislation. It applies to the Upper East Side right now. You can, if you put in low-income housing, you get 20% more. And what he's proposing is when you get an area that would be rezoned, you could do the same sort of thing. The problem is, and John put his finger on it, it works only where you have very expensive land. And that's not going to get you a lot of low-income housing because the price of the land is too high to begin with. The price of construction is too high. So you're going to get a smaller amount than you would in Gowanus that he's talking about for exactly that reason. And we have lots of opportunities that no one is looking at. My favorite is very simple. If you don't have to buy the land and you don't have to build the structure, maybe you can provide housing at a lower price. And I can tell you where I would do it. It's in Staten Island and Eastern Queens, and I would allow anybody who had a garage on the ground floor to convert the garage to a residence. And I will tell you, in a few months, we would have a great number of new apartments, local contractors, not union. The price would be very low. But of course, I doubt it's ever going to happen.
May I just say also, I mean, I think that the issue of, because this gentleman was also asking, I think about the $200,000 figure as an issue of affordability. And I don't know about that figure, but I think his question was, what does that mean if, in terms of, what do we mean when we say affordable if you're talking about people who are, but of course it depends on the size of the family. I don't know about the 200,000 figure, but a family of 6 earning $120,000 in New York City is not, is not a wealthy
It's
family.
not the price of construction, it's the rent that people have to pay.
Right.
And presumably the people who would qualify would be people who are less than 50% of the median income.
Right.
That's the HUD definition.
May I just also turn the conversation just for, we have a few minutes left. You guys have mentioned industry and of course how much the evacuation of industry of New York has profoundly affected the city, and then it recovered. I wrote recently about the Sims recycling plant in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, and which is quite interesting in the, I think as a project, but it also raised, in my mind, a question: should New York continue to try to remain on some level an industrial city? Because there are things which could still be here, providing not just jobs, but crucial services in the city. In the case of the Sunset Recycling Plant, part of the argument was, listen, if you put a plant for recycling on the waterfront there, and you can deliver recycled goods by the waterways, you're going to remove hundreds of thousands of hours of truck traffic from the streets of the city, and you'll continue to keep the waterfront a vital and diverse place, not just a place for luxury housing. I guess it's a long-winded way of saying, to what extent can New York and should New York fight to remain a place where there is some kinds of heavy industry, light industry as well?
First of all, personal preference. I wish this would remain a real city, a producing city, where things are made and has a grit to it. The trend toward becoming a new Venice, where people come to see it and it's all about tourists and it's all about media and it's all about other things. There's a sadness to that, I think, from the city of the past. But having said that, and there are some things, and by the way, the city is growing in many ways, the high-tech jobs too, and it's interesting in New York, two things. One is people are selling quality of life. That would be an absurd concept, I think, in 1980, to say people will want to be in New York because the quality of life is higher here. Now, people take it for granted. That's too bad you have to move somewhere else because it can't be as good as it is here. So I think there has been a vast improvement in that kind of notion about the whole city. But if you just go from Madison Square, which we raised, to the High Line or Chelsea Market, that's becoming a high-tech, not just Google, but all sorts of Yahoo and all sorts of things. And they're retrofitting these old buildings. Think especially of the one that used to be the Port Authority building between 8th and 9th and 15th and 16th. It's as big as the Empire State Building. But who would notice it? You never notice it. But Google noticed it. They paid $2 billion for it. And they're putting a lot of people in there. And that's just one of it. So there is a form of industry that's growing, but it's not heavy industry. Right. But remember, we never had steel manufacture here. We never had big oil refineries, a little bit in Brooklyn, but never big oil refineries. Never did have what you would call as major industry. We don't have the space for it. This city is at least twice as dense as any other American city. It doesn't have space for the stockyards or anything else. So that's a problem. So unless you're going to have small scale bagels, I hate to have my bagels brought in from North Carolina, I do think some things need to stay. Right. But it's a smaller and smaller number.
Another question? Yes, I'm sorry, Alex.
I saw a place that really, I thought, had a key to this. It was in East Williamsburg. It was called the Third Ward, and it was a factory building in which you could become a member and learn a particular trade, whether it's cutting garments or stamping metal or doing computer work. And they trained people who then went out and started industries. But these are small manufacturing kinds of things, fabrication for things that exist in New York. And I think there are a great many things like that that you can do. I think it's unlikely that it's going to happen in great quantity. Then it failed, unfortunately, because of some financial problems with the ownership. But there are places in New York, we have, and it may be for local consumption, but we have all these new breweries and places that are producing alcohol for sale. We have a food industry that's developing. It's a different kind of thing. My father ran a meatpacking factory in Flushing when I was growing up. That's unlikely to happen. It's not even continuing in Omaha, forget about New York. But there are small handicrafts, and if we spent a little bit more time looking at small businesses that are locally started, I think there's an opportunity there that's being missed.
Both is about quality of life and also the diversity of the city and its economic resilience, surely. If the city, as you say, becomes Venice, I mean, Venice is a mess.
And tourism jobs are overall not, I mean, New Orleans is a huge tourist city. It's also a very poor city. And so, I mean, I'm proud that 50 million people visited here. I think that's wonderful, but I don't think we want to hang our economy on that.
Yes, sir.
No one spoke about sea level rise as
You speak louder.
the sea level rise and its future impact in New York City. What are some of the strategies that the city's taking to deal with that? And also, are you relying on private developers to individually deal with the issue rather than a comprehensive strategy for the whole city?
Rising water. Rising water.
Well,
Well, I'll go first. As a historian, I like to see what's happened in the past. And of course, the question is going to be whether Sandy is the leading edge of a huge climate change in which the ocean really is going to rise 10 or 20 feet or whatever. And by the way, I do believe in global warming, but I think that's a different thing. In 400 years, essentially, New York never had a Sandy. I mean, it had rising water, and sometimes there was water. You know, at one time, the East River supposedly froze, and you could walk to Brooklyn. But basically, we have been relatively free from natural disasters for 400 years. So I'm going to kind of go with that and say I don't think Sandy's going to happen again. Water will go up, but what everybody's doing in Lower Manhattan is taking their generators and raising them above the street, because that's what probably knocked everything out. Right? All the power was below water, below the street level, and everything went black. And so that's happening all over the place in Lower Manhattan. Government buildings, private buildings.
I'm sorry to do this, but obviously to talk about everything going black,
I think they told us.
This is a huge and important question, which I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to address more, but our time has run out. I wanted to thank all three of you very much, and thank you all for coming.